Okay, we have a lot to cover today, so we're not going to wait any longer for the laggards. Welcome to this Technology Business Research webinar series. Today, I'm Patrick Heffernan, and I'm going to be joined by some of my colleagues, Geoff and Jack and Boz and Kelly, and we're going to talk through the long view. What are the trends that in IT services and cloud and software and all of technology really that are going to be shaping the post-pandemic world? So before we get started, a few housekeeping things. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a series of buttons. You can access the slides, audio controls, Q&A, speaker bios, all that, and a survey. And after this webinar, you'll get an email from us with the replay link as well as a link to view and register for some other webinars. And if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A widget. We will try to answer them as we go along. And what we don't get to, of course, we'll answer when we have a chance after the webinar. So this is who's going to be speaking today. We've actually got a wide range of ages on here, which I think is important as we think about the long view. Some of us, Geoff and I, are going to be looking at 2030 as toward the end of our professional lives, but Kelly and Jack certainly won't be. So that's what we wanted to bring today, is a view of the future from the different perspectives that we're coming at it. So what we're going to specifically cover, first, we need to frame the trends that are happening now, that have been happening leading up to 2020, and think about post-pandemic expectations in that framework. We'll talk about what kind of emerging technologies now are really going to shape the next 10 years. We're going to position artificial intelligence as a bridge between technology and humans, and we'll get into exactly what we mean by that during the presentation. Then finally, we're going to wrap up with a sort of a big question: are we on the edge of a fallow period of technology really kind of staying stagnant for a while, or are we moving into a new enlightenment? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Geoff to sort of give us the historical view to bring us up to date so we know what we're starting with before we start thinking about the future. So Geoff?
Thanks, Patrick. Hi, this is Geoff Woollacott. The slide that you're seeing, if you're on the Quantum webinar, is a replay, and I don't want to take a lot of time here. But what this is seeking to depict, in the bottom of it is a company some of you may recall that was called Digital Equipment Corp, or DEC. And on the top part of that is a whole series of vendors in there, primarily IBM, Microsoft, Red Hat, and VMware, which were the ones, and Intel, which were the ones, the top part, which essentially knocked out the mini computer market, where digital was the flagship vendor. So just in terms of timeline context, what I want to point your attention to is digital was founded around 57 or 58. Their first big system, the PDP Mini, came out in the mid-60s, or about 8 years later. And then the VAX Super Mini came out in the mid-70s and really consolidated the market to the point at one time they had a higher market cap than IBM. But shortly after that higher market cap, 4 years later, they ran into trouble as the Wintel juggernaut, Windows Intel Inside, was starting to wipe out the mini systems. So they went, Olson left around 90, it was like 92. They were bought by Compaq in 98, and then Compaq was bought by HP in 2002, 2003. And the reason for that is up above, where you see Red Hat and VMware being founded, open source hypervisor coming out in VMware servers. So if you look just at the timeline, it was kind of decade lurches for different mini systems. But then as we got smarter with open standards, interoperability, it was no longer having to make a bet if you were a software developer from proprietary operating systems and proprietary architectures into, in today's language, to use IBM, they're making a big bet on OpenShift and hybrid multi-cloud interconnectivity. So this is the platform. It took us 40, 50 years, however you want to define it, to build this. I don't want to call it an irrelevant platform. You can call it a commoditized platform in the sense you can build it and plug and play from multiple different vendors. So it's that, the movement to the multi-enterprise business network or the ecosystem business. And on top of that now is what is coming over the next 10 years, which we can touch upon on the next slide. So putting it into the context of COVID-19, there's a lot of talk, the fourth industrial revolution, the Industry 4.0, at TBR, we've been calling it the business of one, this idea of the one sort of monolithic ecosystem, working out to each individual. And so what COVID-19 has done is it's sort of induced labor. It's induced the societal rebirth that has got to come, and public policy is now going to have to grapple with how to accommodate it, as well as businesses. So at the top of that is a quote that I found, our editors found out it was RFK quoting somebody else. I thought it was Robert Kennedy. But even in our sleep, our pain, which cannot forget, falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair against our will comes wisdom. And I think if you take a look at public policy debates, it can be argued we're trying to come up with solutions against our will. But what are the enabling tools that are going to get us there? If we're getting into a digital economy, if we're getting into digital business, we have human data, we have ways to do that. But IoT now ingests the machines for operations, for removing human toil from business process. Blockchain provides that immutable record for the frictionless data exchange. So you can take out of AI all the data wrangling, the data cleansing. We're hearing about it today in the COVID-19 pandemic as people are trying to run algorithms and analytics to figure out what's going on. They haven't got the standard data sets coming in from all the states or countries. So then you're hearing about errors and everything else, or, oh, that isn't right because of this, that, or the other thing. So blockchain is the way to get human beings out of the way as you're trying to join data sets. And then 5G, of course, is for the rapid movement of that data. And all of that ingests the data for algorithms and algorithm development. There are the variational algorithms that run today and will run on quantum, and then there are the algorithms being developed that can only run on quantum. So these are the underlying technologies over the next 20, 30 years that are going to radically change what we do and get us in full bore into the fourth industrial revolution. So the challenge, to paraphrase the quote above, is we're struggling to break from the conventional public policy wisdom that's prevailed since the end of World War II. Against our will, we'll find the new policy prescriptions for the digital economy. And with that, I'll turn it over to Patrick.
Thanks. And I just want to say right from the start here, as it says in the slide, we're all going to be wrong, just in different ways. And we're going to come around again to sort of how we're looking at the world differently and how we're trying to. But a couple things to just keep in mind. I think it's really important. This idea that there's a new routine. No one likes new normal. I think, but we are getting used to a routine of wearing a mask in a grocery store. It's not normal, but it's the routine. And I think a lot of the things that we're seeing now look more dramatic than they really are in the large scope of things. Another thing that's important, and think about it this way, as I saw recently, somebody made the comment that even after 9/11, we kept getting on planes and flying. So certain things are going to persist no matter what. E-commerce is going to persist no matter what. So then another important thing is that the changes that are going to happen are going to come from things that we know are out there. We just don't know quite what the how and the why and the when that those changes are going to come from. And then the last point, we're terrible at predicting the future, but we're pretty good at living in it. We really do need to think through the possibilities, even knowing that you're probably going to be wrong. And I'm going to come back at the very end of this to exactly what it looks like to sort of think through the possibilities. I do want to turn it over now to Kelly to kind of give us a look at what was coming before the pandemic, exactly what we're experiencing now, particularly in the IT services world, and then looking at an initial look at what's coming beyond that. So Kelly?
Thanks, Patrick. So on this slide, we wanted to take a look at what happened previously and kind of taking what happened then to predict or as an insight to what would come forward. In 2010 to 2019, I think it's a similar situation to what's ahead of us. They were just coming out of downturn, so it was more of a recovery phase. During that downturn previously, the consulting engagements, they were shrinking as clients were looking at more immediate needs and pushing their non-essentials to the side. This did lead to growth in outsourcing, giving them the more immediate revenue return. However, it did pick back up, and that led to an acceleration in hiring. So as time went on, it quickly did pick back up afterwards, and they were able to hire and kind of look into those new portfolio areas. So vendors were seeking out new talent to develop and scale their portfolio. Some of the areas that I was looking at were cloud computing and analytics. This trend has continued throughout up until 2020. Vendors have been increasing talent I think at a faster, looking to scale them up more quickly and looking to develop non-traditional roles. So they've been using talent to generate portfolio growth as well as client traction to help blend old models with new IT models using these newer technologies. There was also a greater push to develop vertical-led assets. A few years back in the late 2010s, a lot of the vendors were looking at vertical go-to-market strategies. So if they didn't previously employ a vertical go-to-market, a lot of them were looking to develop it or implement some type of strategy that took into consideration vertical capabilities. The only difference here was, or I guess not different from today, but the geographic aspect is also coming into play here. Some of the geopolitical situations caused vendors to take into account the regional and geographic specific conditions when trying to bring the vertical go-to-market in those areas, which led to some considerations around particular acquisitions. Moving on to more close to today, COVID has disrupted a lot of vendors' traditional strategies, their business models, and it kind of pushed them to change the way they look at transformations. Clients themselves are shifting their priorities from more of those higher touch to high touch, large scale strategic transformation discussions to more of tactical run the business and price competitive managed services opportunities. So they're changing the way that they're looking at what's necessary and what is not as necessary. So the vendors need to be careful in the way that they shift their strategies and marketing tactics to successfully navigate this and be more effective in selling these newer technologies. While vendors are kind of pushing some of the more higher value or some of the more luxury, you could call them, areas, they're kind of pushing those to the side. There are some opportunities coming out of this, particularly around change management, work from home policies, and remote learning, as the nature of the work being done within its clients' environments is changing. Some vendors have seen, or they have opened, they've created new units within their own businesses looking to create pandemic-related business units or specifically COVID-19 business units as they're looking, or with the expectation that opportunities will continue into 2021. Something that I think is kind of brought up for these vendors is some of these capabilities aren't really all that new. It was things that they had before. It was more repackaged, repurposed, and redirected to address these things. So it kind of it broke down some of those internal barriers, and it helped vendors realize what was actually possible. So they were able to do things much quicker than they had in the past. An engagement that was months long needed to be turned around much quicker as the need was right then and there. So I think that kind of helped them see what was possible, and helped them bring things to market a bit more quickly than they had in the past. COVID has also helped drive increasing demand for cloud and digital solutions. Some of those clients that were not as willing to embrace some of these newer technologies before, COVID has kind of pushed them to seize these opportunities to do it. Some of the vendors that have been a bit more flexible with payment terms or pro bono solution or engagements, it's helped the clients embrace those at a better pace for them. and it sets them up to build off of that going forward. And the vendors that have been able to keep the relationships with their clients and become that trusted advisor will be able to continue this going forward. Shifting forward from 2022 to 2030, everything, at least in terms of services for me, always goes back to the talent aspect. And I think where talent has been a major part of, or a big investment area for the past 10 years, I don't think that's going to change going forward. I think if anything, it's going to become more reinforced, especially the aspect of reskilling and providing ongoing mentoring and training in order to keep your people more agile and flexible, so that way they can shift and adapt to changing market needs, changing in the technologies. They'll have those skills that they need to really embrace what comes next. There were two examples I wanted to call out that I had seen from the vendors. One of them was Atos. Over the past few years, they've been, or 3 years, sorry, they've been looking to digitally certify its workforce, and as of June 2020, they had noted that 95% of their employees were digitally certified, and so they're really investing in their employees to make sure they have the skills that they need. And in order to make better use of, or make sure that they're getting the best use of these skills that they can, Atos had implemented a resource matching model. So it aligns the employees' competencies, skills, strengths with certain projects or assignments that they have. So it makes sure that their skills are supporting areas where they're best suited, and it's able to help them improve business outcomes. The other example I want to call out was BCG. I think their mentoring program has helped them get the right people in the right place and help foster the skills that they need to be successful. And I think that is something that's going to continue as we go forward, as they do need to be able to adapt more rapidly to changing, as we saw. The quick adoption of cloud and digital definitely showed the need to be able to rapidly respond to things and adapt your traditional skills, or adapt your new normal or normal going forward. And the last thing is security. I think security, unfortunately, has fallen to the back burner of a lot of digital initiatives. It was not always, it's sometimes seen as more of an afterthought, not as the forefront of the digital projects or any transformation. I think COVID has brought out a lot of the vulnerabilities within security networks that need to be addressed. It's also kind of brought out some of the nature of it that's kind of changed. The same things that were of concern a few years ago are not necessarily as concerned. If you think of people working from home, logins at different times and locations does not seem as weird now with people working at home as it was maybe a few years ago. I think this is an opportunity for vendors, though, as they can kind of fill that gap between technologies and their clients to help them realize the priority that security should take and help them move it up in their essential projects. And with that, I'll hand it back to Patrick.
Thanks very much. And Kelly brought up something really important about people, that when this pandemic first hit, the conversations we had with all the IT services vendors and the consultancies kept coming around to this sort of real ethos about protecting their people. So hopefully that carries forward over the next 10 years and accelerates even. So we're now going to move into what's coming next, now that we've sort of laid the foundation of our thinking going into this moment. And so you can see here, we're thinking that artificial intelligence really is that bridge between all these emerging technologies and the humans. And it's something that we sort of hear again and again, that, you know, the technology is easy. It's the humans that are always the problem. We're going to get to that, but first we're going to start with Jack telling us a little bit about where he thinks some of the technology is going. So I'll hand it over to Jack now.
Sure. Thanks, Patrick. Right, so I just wanted to jump into 5G a little bit. Enterprises are going to be using it to connect their data centers and cloud environments with IoT sensors. Examples of that are IoT devices in like refrigerated trucks, for example. So that way you can regulate the temperature inside the truck or get alerts if it's too high or low, or in manufacturing, so equipment doesn't fail, or connected vehicles. And I'll go a little bit more into detail on this next slide after. But there are also other use cases, or within these use cases rather, they create rich information that can be leveraged for analytics and help train AI and machine learning models, which Geoff briefly touched upon. And cloud vendors want to capitalize on this opportunity. and they're going to increase their value proposition in industries by enabling those 5G and IoT connected scenarios. So recently we've seen those cloud and telecom vendors partner to integrate their networks and create those 5G use cases. Just briefly, some of those were like Microsoft has created Azure Edge Zones, partnering with AT&T, AWS's Wavelength, partnering with Verizon. And those are going to be countrywide in the US by 2030. And telecom operators aren't going to marry themselves to any one of these vendors. They're going to be more agnostic to ensure that their customers can use whichever cloud provider that they are looking to use. And then in terms of where we'll see these cloud and telecom partnerships and leadership in 5G around the world, in US and Canada, it's, like I said, going to be ubiquitous by 2030. There's a current lack in mid-band spectrum that's available, but that's going to open up, and once acquisitions of that mid-band spectrum are made in the next few years, that's going to help accelerate 5G. And then also in Canada, following the country's spectrum auction planned for an unspecified time frame in 2020, that's going to accelerate probably a little bit faster. And in Europe, places like the UK, Italy, Spain, and the United Arab Emirates is definitely going to be a leader. In the Middle East, where they already have 5G coverage across 80% of the country. And lastly, in China, South Korea, Japan, those are some of the leaders in 5G. And something that was kind of noteworthy that actually happened recently is that the United Kingdom is going to be banning Huawei 5G technology. So we're going to see a greater divide between the East and West. So the telecom operators, cloud vendors, and the different industries that utilize 5G technology are really going to be more segregated by Eastern and Western, kind of APAC versus US and European vendors. So kind of looking into the time frame for all of this, the initial investment in 5G right now is just being justified by consumer use cases. Fixed wireless access is something that is going to be particularly, I guess you'd say, convincing for shareholders, because that's going to be competing with cable providers. So there won't be a monopoly that many of us have had to deal with our cable providers. And it's going to drive down those costs for consumers. But that gives 5G and telecom operators more funding and inroads. It enables them to innovate more for specific business use cases. 20 to 2025, it's going to be mostly gaming, smart city, manufacturing, and warehouse automation. Whereas 25 to 2030, we're going to see fully autonomous vehicles, remote surgery, more complex use cases. And Patrick, if you don't mind moving to the next slide, we can jump onto some of those industry use cases there. So in AR, VR gaming, the ultra low latency enabled by 5G coupled with edge computing capabilities really are going to benefit the gaming industry as cloud-based and AR, VR platforms gain further traction over the next several years, especially by 2030. It's going to allow for remote game development, be more dynamic, which is going to be something that a lot of enterprises have realized with this COVID-19 pandemic, is that they need to be able to quickly shift their, in this example, to a remote environment, but really have a dynamic business environment. And cloud helps enable that. And that's helped lead to some cloud adoption recently. And they can use things like high performance computing, which typically you had to be on site to be able to render those workloads for gaming. And just wanted to touch on briefly, that's probably going to eliminate the need for consoles with 5G gaming, just because you're going to be able to use your phone, which is going to be a 5G enabled device. Some of us are still running on iPhone 7s, so I won't say specifically myself, but there's going to be some people that aren't going to be moving on to this by 2030. But the majority of people are going to have 5G enabled devices that allow them to run gaming on their phones or on computers. And game developers are going to be moving to cloud vendors, so that way they can provide those gaming experiences. Like Google Stadia, for example, is a big one among the Western vendors, and then towards the east, there's Tencent, who's been partnering with Huawei in that area. And then briefly want to touch on just military. They're able to use 5G for use cases like drone management and mitigation, missile guidance systems, and AR and VR-based training exercises. And then in military and policing, we think facial recognition is going to be a large part, or it's going to be more widely used by 2030. And domestically in the US, there needs to be policies put in place there. Microsoft isn't selling until those policies are in place, as well as other vendors. But once those policies are in place, it's going to essentially position governments and the military to say that there's safety guidelines now, so it's okay, you don't have to worry. So they're going to push for that, and it's going to be pervasive by 2030, we believe. And lastly, connected vehicles. Similar to gaming, they're going to be using cloud platforms. That way they can be more dynamic. If you think about for autonomous driving use cases, they're going to need to be able to scale with those spikes during holidays, for example, when there's more drivers on the road, and use those cloud platforms for developing those, and then connecting them with the 5G networks, which in a very cool type of idea that some of the automotive manufacturers or car companies have been talking about, is creating a type of beehive mentality where you can have cars that communicate with each other, so that way they can drive closer together on the road, or one day you can eliminate the need for stoplights. So we think that there's going to be essentially roads that are autonomous vehicle only lanes by 2030. And then after that, there will eventually be autonomous vehicle only highways. So that way cars can travel at higher speeds close together. So we can move on to the next slide after those industry use cases. And I'll hand it off to Geoff.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. The first thing I want to do is, from that prior slide, we don't need to go back to it, is the operative phrase in what you were saying, Jack, is once the policies are in place. That's, again, what it reminds me of was an analyst conference where the management consulting firm was talking about what they could do with the ServiceNow platform, and all the various customers were firing questions at this individual left, right, and center. And the individual just leaned against the wall, paused for a second, smiled, and said, "We can do whatever you want. You just have to make up your mind." And we need public policy holders to make up their minds. We need them to come to consensus on what the rules are. We need NIST to get involved. And the classic example of this is the COVID era. Think of contact tracing. If we had it, or if we were more diligent at it, and then it's government calling you to say, you have COVID, who have you dealt with? Or we know your Google data, we can send them alerts. There's a whole set of new issues that we're going to have to determine and figure out in order to be able to get this done. But this is just but one example of how the technology's there. It could do it. We could be very good at this, but what's the privacy law? What's the opt-in for citizens? I mean, we're getting our backs up as a nation over being recommended that we wear a mask to go to a grocery store. So what's it going to be like if they're saying, give us your phone data in the event that you get COVID, so we can then do the contact tracing and send out alerts to other people? So there's a whole host of issues there that are going to need to be resolved. And it's primarily going to be on the public sector to get it done. Business in a vacuum will go out and do things, but then they'll have the lost productivity if and when government finally gets off the dime and establishes a new set of rules or provisioning for the new economy, rather than just clinging to the old mantras that worked in the post-World War II era. And with that, I'll turn it back to Patrick to move along.
Thanks. And actually, this is Go ahead, Boz. Go ahead.
No, if you had some comment, go ahead. Sorry, didn't interrupt you.
Now, I was just going to say it's the perfect time to sort of transition into, okay, now we've talked about the possibilities and the roadblocks, and now it's artificial intelligence, and Boz is going to explain exactly how that serves as the bridge between the two.
Yes, thank you. And just kind of like on the last point that Geoff was making about governance and kind of like the public-private policies that needs to be established, I think an important piece to, before kind of going to the next 10 years for AI, there's a couple of things to point here. I mean, Geoff in an earlier slide mentioned that AI is one of those change agent technologies, which I think it's an important element as we think about the evolution of technology and people and society as a whole. I think, but for AI to function, there's certainly a few building blocks that have to be put in place. So the data quality is certainly a key element, and how the data orchestration between all parties is established is certainly a key element. We still see poor data quality as preventing for AI to really hinder the accelerated adoption. So we think that then we see as AI starts to become more sophisticated, establishment of more data standards, and not just data standards that are within departmental systems, but intra-departmental and broader the ecosystem between the different technologies that have to communicate with each other, between 5G and edge and cloud and everything blockchain that we've been talking about. So certainly the need for data standards and data interoperability standards will be something to be put in place before AI takes, accelerates. Especially as the algorithms become more sophisticated, and the black box essentially of the AI still requires more transparency and accountability. So these are certainly key pieces to think about. The other piece, as Geoff started to talk about, was governance. I think it's governance. It's when it comes to AI moving forward. As we know, we're already using AI in many ways in our everyday lives today, from Google Maps to voice assistants to e-commerce, when we often just opt in without even reading the fine print or the consent form that, that those companies are typically put in front of our face. We'll just say, yes, agree, and move on because of the convenience factor, right? So we don't, really care if the big brother, the government, or the company, is what they're doing with our data, as long as we get the convenience factor. But then all of a sudden we get upset when those establishments starts to sell our data or start to market to our data, and then we are raising questions about public laws and privacy, data privacy laws, and so forth. So the question then becomes, if that's such an issue, how should we then enable and empower the citizens and consumers to really to template their own governance framework before they actually opt in and really get engaged in to start thinking about how AI can change our lives and be that change agent of technology and society as a whole. One can ask the question: could AI be used to develop those templates? With somewhat like a chicken and the egg question for many of the for the participants, but certainly one way from the organization standpoint is to start to build the trust and to within the the citizens and the consumers to start building those self-governing bodies and establishment internal ethics and compliance groups that actually is vetting those requests and trying to say, is that something that we've been asked to do, the right thing to do for the society and for the consumer? So it has to be kind of a dialogue. Just like the data exchange have to be established standards, there have to be an ethics and compliance exchange dialogue, and have to be self-accounted on each party. Otherwise, AI can still face some challenges even through 2030. One way to think about that is, we know that going back to 2010, with social media and everything coming up, we start thinking about, okay, what does social media mean to our personal life, to our professional life? 10 years later, we're fairly comfortable with social media, how it's used, and largely because now we got to expose in our personal life, now we're able to bring it to our professional life. So consumerization of business applications as a trend, as a framework, it's certainly one way to think about what's the required change management activities as we try to think about AI, as we start to think about AI and governance around AI, and have to make sure that we're able to explain AI, make sure that we account for the liability around AI. So many companies are starting to think about developing centers of excellence within their organizations, of how they actually, preaching the notion and the possibilities around AI, getting like ambassadors of AI and trying to be used as those change agents within organizations. So the two-way dialogue, the data exchange, the protocols, and the governance is certainly still frameworks that, as you think about how much we already use AI in our everyday lives and bring that private, personal experience of AI into the enterprise, I think it's where we'll be able to help in a way to move forward with the adoption of AI beyond our personal lives. And moving on to that slide in the public sector, I think Geoff started talking about earlier about the public sector as being one of the the points of of reference as an organization, as a governing body of technologies. And if we think about here, just take a moment here in the U.S. Right now, the federal funded R&D budget on AI is set to double in 2021. So it's certainly the government is thinking about AI from an R&D perspective. It's not ignoring. We know that the military and intelligence community is already using quite a bit of AI for different purposes. But we have to think about it in a way of just because there's the budget request for for the 2021 budget for R&D budget for AI to double, doesn't mean that increased spending without any clear plan for implementation might be a recipe for disaster. So we know that some agencies, like I said, have started doubling down on the path of developing AI strategies, like the Department of Defense, which essentially set up the Joint Artificial Intelligence Centers back in 2018. Others have just begun considering AI, how can they enhance operations. So I think as we think about AI and technology in the public sector as a way, as a proxy of how maybe commercially AI can be deployed and accelerate the deployment and adoption, just like the commercial sector, just like the public sector and the commercial sector, the public sector too still faces talent shortages, which essentially impacts the implementation of AI and automation and analytics and those technologies. So while the government is really busy trying to find new ways to attract talent besides its mission, also it needs to be looking for new ways for people that they have to do more with those technologies. So there's kind of like a lot to juggle as we think about those frameworks that have to have in place for AI to become the change agent of the next decade. But certainly some good use cases already that we can see from a public sector, but also we have to also as a society and as consumers and citizens have to be a little bit more ease on and really think about how much do we demand from privacy data sharing, and do we want to control that, or will we trust then the government to take control over that? So with that, I'll turn it over to Geoff to kind of wrap up that section and move on to the next one.
Yeah, thank you, Boz. This slide is looking more at the human side. It's conjuring in my head. It's something Patrick and I wrote 3 years ago called the Digital Dust Bowl, the impending Digital Dust Bowl. And I'm in the middle of rethinking how to revise it. Hopefully it'll be out of my head in a week or two. But the challenge here is just gaining the consensus between the citizens, the businesses, and the public, the public policy holders, in order to fully grasp, comprehend the new risks associated with the new economy that we're moving into. We're not a post-World War II Mad Men era manufacturing economy anymore. Yet our public policies were built and arguably did a good job regulating that from 46 to 2005, 2010, something like that. And now it's kind of teetering, and we need change. We need experimentation. We need compromise. We need contribution. And really, when I look at that, the tech firms have almost I don't want to call it a moral obligation, an opportunity to be able to help shape that, because the fundamentals of the change are coming out of what we have lived and what we do. And from that regard, I think the best folks that can be the bridge there are the same ones who have been the bridge on the tax and audit side, which are the advisory management consulting firms. But that's basically the need, is for these public-private partnerships, trust and consensus. And that's like the operative word back when I was joking with Jack on his slide of once the public policies are set. And Patrick, I know you had something you wanted to add here.
Yeah, Geoff, you mentioned the keyword trust, and yeah, I would throw out there, I think one of the things that's a real challenge right now, a lot of us are experiencing what challenges lie ahead with returning to the workplace, but also much more immediately our children returning to school, and sort of the real huge gap between technology that's available at every different level and the decisions that have to be made with respect to safety and health and risk and all that. And what is really missing, the key component, isn't the technology. The technology is there for remote learning. The technology is there for actually being in the physical classroom with the risks mitigated. What's missing is trust all the way across the entire spectrum. And so that, I think, is what really can't be solved by technology. It has to be solved by humans. So with that semi-grim thought, we'll jump to a quick session here on where are we going to be in the next 10 years? Are we going to go through a period of lack of innovation, of lack of change, a deceleration to all the emerging technologies that we've seen over the last 10 years because of budgets, because of lack of trust, because of, Jack mentioned the Huawei bit, because of a bifurcation between East and West over technology? Are we going to go through a period where the macroeconomics are such that the kind of innovation and change that we've been seeing for the last 10 years is impossible? Or is it going to be more of a age of an enlightenment, more like the Renaissance, where the end of the Black Plague brought around a lot of new creativity in the arts, new creativity in insurance and banking, and new creativity in things like military systems, all of which I am fully well aware that living during the time of the Renaissance was a lot worse than living in the time of the Middle Ages. That's a whole nother history webinar we can do. But the important question is, what's going to happen in the next 10 years? Is it going to be stagnation, or is it going to be wild acceleration? And so we're going to do a quick little poll of all the presenters here, and just sort of get a thumbs up, thumbs down vote on which way we're going, and maybe a quick reason why. So we'll go in age order. So we'll go Geoff, and then Boz, and then Kelly, and Jack. And so Geoff, you're up first. Which way are we going?
All right, I'd say we're going to have an age of enlightenment due to desperate times calling for desperate measures. The macroeconomic economy will take a dip, but the businesses, in order to try to figure out how to survive in the slower economy, will be doing a lot of innovation. So it's an age of enlightenment in a bad economy.
All right, Boz?
I think that the issue of trust you just raised will increase. There'll be a further gap in the trust. I think the trust will become on a societal level. I think the trust between East and the West will further expand. I know that the Cold War ended 30 years ago, just about, but I think the trust between East and the West, enabled by technology, that gap will further increase, which could not be a bad scenario for further competition. But I think while in the past was arms race, now maybe a technology race, and that could actually maybe a good for the economies of each side.
Well, the economy of Venice did extremely well after the Black Plague, so you could be right. Jack?
I'd say I think it's going to be a bit of a mix. I think that decision makers that want to move away from the business of old and drive their digital transformations are going to use the pandemic to make that change. They're going to message the value of new technologies to their stakeholders and how those technologies are going to help prevent headaches during unexpected changes like the pandemic caused. So they're going to essentially use the pandemic as a Trojan horse to initiate those digital transformations that they've been trying to get moving on. And that will also create a divide between companies that are kind of changing, accepting those digital transformations, and those that are going to essentially stay with the old guard.
And Kelly, where are you on this?
I think I'm more on the Enlightenment side. I'm trying to keep an open mind. I think the rapid acceleration of some of these technologies, like the rapid adoption, I think that's kind of opened the door to what is possible, and I think some of the parties will use that as a lever, in a sense, to quicken their development and kind of see what else you can do. I think it'll more or less quicken or increase the pace of what they were trying to do a while ago, so it'll open the door for new things to come out, as they were more or less forced to adopt these new tools, so I think they will be able to use them to see what else they can do.
And so that leaves me as the lone voice arguing for a dark period here for the next 10 years. And, you know, the reason I say that is not just today's skepticism, but early on in the pandemic, as I mentioned before, there was a real ethos around protecting, taking care of, looking out for people. And that lasted a little bit, and then pretty quickly it shifted to productivity. It shifted to, so, you know, what's the rebalancing going to look like when we go back to work? I think we're going to go through a period, this is me being very pessimistic, and I hope I'm wrong. I hope my colleagues are right. Now, and based on that, in a way, we're going to tell a little quick story. Believe it or not, we're actually going to connect the elk in eastern Kentucky to all of technology in the next 10 years. So the story here is that the last elk was killed in eastern Kentucky, in Kentucky as a whole, before the Civil War. You know, you go before that, and there was all kinds of wildlife in Kentucky, and you can imagine what it was like. But you know, prior to the start of the Civil War, last one's killed, they're eradicated out of the state. And then in the 60s, 60s through the 70s, you started having mountaintop removal mining, where you can see that picture there, and there's other much more stark pictures you can look up on the internet of what it looked like when mining companies came in and shaved the top of a mountain off in order to pull out coal. So then you think to 1997, they actually flew in 1,500 elk, were flown in from out west, to start a new population of elk in eastern Kentucky, and there's now over 13,000 of them in the state. And so why does that even matter? Well, if you were looking at that mountaintop in 1975 and you thought about, well, this would be a perfect place for tourism. This is where we can get some eco-tourists to come in, some hikers, some birders. We can even get hunters to come in and hunt the elk population of eastern Kentucky. You'd be told you were completely crazy. Nobody foresaw that. Nobody at all. Even the people in 1997 were hoping for the best, but they didn't imagine it was going to get to the point where it is now, where there really is tourism built on going to see the elk in eastern Kentucky. And it's eastern, not western, because elk actually consume an awful lot of food every day to stay alive. They're ravenous beasts in that way. And why that's important is because the landscape in eastern Kentucky had been so altered by the mountaintop removal mining that it actually became, once it recovered, perfect terrain for elk, for an elk habitat. So all of which is a way of saying, are we really thinking wildly and creatively and smart enough? I mean, when we look at today's technology, all the things that we've talked about over the course of this hour, and all the different ideas that are out there for where we might be going, are we really just sort of wildly misunderestimating the change that can happen? I mean, you know, where are the elk today? 13,000 of them in Kentucky. Where are they going to be? Are we going to need to wait 10 years to see that kind of change in the technology space, or are we going to need to wait even longer than that? So we're going to go once more around the horn with everybody, and this time, instead of a dark prediction or a light prediction, I'm going to ask that they all give us a headline from July 15th of 2030. What are we going to read, if we even read the papers? That may be crazy too, just in the thought of it, but what's the headline going to be? And we'll go in the same order we did last time. So, Geoff, you're up. What's your July 15, 2030 headline?
Okay, July 2030, President Yang announces the formation of the Federal Autonomous Vehicle Administration, or FAVA, for certifying the security and reliability of autonomous vehicles after the terrorist attack that jammed Tesla vehicles, causing a massive traffic accident on I-280 in San Francisco.
That's pretty good. I like it. All right, Boz, you're next.
Wow. How can I top that? Cyber blackout raises questions about AI's future, and even further challenges the opportunities for biotech enabled technologies.
So you're anticipating that biotech and AI both are going to be at the point in 2030 way beyond where they are now?
I anticipate that AI will be beyond the point where it is today, and certainly the cyber blackouts that I'm anticipating will question the existence of the biotech even more if it is today.
Yeah, security is always one of the scariest elements of all of this, and like Kelly was saying earlier, it's something that had been too frequently forgotten in digital transformation engagements. Kelly, you're up next. What's your 2030 headline?
Funny enough, it has to do with security. I was thinking gaps in security disrupt technology growth and progress within business models, hindering overall growth. I'm thinking the gaps in security that have been left unaddressed are going to rear their heads and really disrupt the nature of things. Like if you look at Cognizant, their ransomware attack really set them back quite a bit. And I don't think that's the last one we're going to see.
All right, Jack.
I'd say mine sounds like it predates Geoff's a little bit, but I'd say the United States creates its first Autobahn with an autonomous vehicle highway.
A lot of speculation and a lot of interest around where automobiles are going to go, and at the same time, there's a lot of talk about how do they completely take cars, private cars, individual cars, out of all of Manhattan, and even beyond that. And so I think one of the things that to me is going to happen in the automotive space is a real sharp divide between where people want to have cars. Not have them in terms of own them, but actually have cars around them and be in the presence of cars, and where people are going to want to be in a new kind of car-free world. So I guess my prediction for July 15th of 2020 is the headline is going to be the big two, tax, audit, and consulting firms agree to merger. So we'll see exactly if that comes around or not. We've got a couple questions that have come in, and I'll try and get to them in the time that we have remaining. One of the questions is highly charged and political, but we'll ask it anyway. Do you think a change in U.S. government with some new ideas will help artificial intelligence bridge these gaps that were brought up? I think the answer is definitely, well, the answer is both yes and no. Yes, a change would help. Do I think it'll help AI bridge the gaps any more quickly than a lack of change? I'm not entirely sure. It's an area that probably is going to accelerate the way Boz and Geoff described, absent really the political nature at the top. It's going to be more about what's happening within state and local governments and at a more private public partnership thing that Geoff talked about, which is not necessarily always at the federal level. So another question, what's the outlook for application platforms? For example, SAP, will AI and machine learning powered technologies like AWS Connect become the interaction point for end users? That's a great question. Jack is our software and cloud guy on the line, so maybe he can take a stab at that first, and then Geoff, I'm sure you have some thoughts on it.
Sure. Yeah, I would say, all right, so the outlook for application platforms, I would say that SAP is going to, I'm just double checking this question, become the primary interaction point. I wouldn't say that AWS is going to be the primary interaction point. I think that actually telco vendors and co-location vendors are going to help create the actual connections, whereas something like AWS Outposts is going to be the actual server that's going to be connecting back to the public cloud. I think that hybrid cloud through public cloud and hosted on-prem, as well as hybrid IT, so public cloud and on-premises server, are going to feed data from IoT devices that connect to that edge point and then feed back to the public cloud. And kind of stemming off of that a little bit, I think that Kubernetes is going to be a much larger player by 2030 to help enable that. So enabling those IoT workloads to move back to an on-prem server, which is like running in containers on Kubernetes and then able to go back to the public cloud for higher level or larger scale training models and IoT use cases.
And Boz, I think you had a point on this as well, right?
Yeah, I think actually a little bit different angle here, because from the services side and from the buyer side, what we have heard in recent interviews have been changing the way contracts are being managed, and buyers are often looking into hyperscalers and hyperscalers technologies that they bring forward to as a central point of contract management. So take, for example, let's say you engage with AWS as your hyperscaler. Now you'll put all your, trust into AWS and let them deal with all the subcontractors, all the subcontracting technologies that they may have to connect in the back end, both on the technology side as well as the relationship side. So could with AI and ML powered technology, like AWS Connect, be the primary interaction point for end users? I think there's a possibility, and it will be less so on the technology capability side, more on the how contracts are being managed and the role of hyperscalers moving forward and trying to put some pressure on systems integrators and consultancies for that matter, and the role and how they become really a centralized node in the ecosystem, the partner ecosystem. I think that's going to bring up those technologies front and center more so than actual technology connectivity.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So we got time for a couple more questions, and they keep flowing in. One of them is, how does edge networking fit into this 10-year timeline? When does edge networking reach its zenith in terms of being required? So we're going to go to both, again, Boz and Jack on this, but I just want to point out we published earlier this year a digital transformation emerging technologies report that was specific on edge, looking at how edge is being deployed primarily in services engagements. So you can reach out to us afterwards to get a look at that. We also, my personal opinion has a lot to do with how ports can be used as sort of a test bed for smart cities. Again, we've written on that pretty extensively, and reach out, we can send you that. But Jack, if you want to take a quick shot at edge, and then we'll hand to Boz as well.
I was on mute. Sure. So I would say that edge computing it's not going to be 2030. I think it's going to be sooner than that, where it's going to really, reach its zenith, to use the question in my answer. Because already we've created those use cases for edge computing from an infrastructure level with Microsoft and AWS, and then at the platform level using Kubernetes with IBM and Google. They're already building out their partner ecosystems around that, and the possibility is there that essentially the infrastructure, the framework of it is there. We just have to be able to really create the use cases around it. So I'd say by 2025, I'd say the edge is really going to reach that zenith, and then the use cases that edge enables are going to be kind of between now and 2030.